Welcome, one and all. My name is Greg Peterson. I am one of the co-founders of the Robert H. Jackson Center, which is designed to advance the legacy of Justice Jackson. We're so thrilled to host this amazing event commemorating the 75th anniversary of the Korematsu decision, of which Justice Jackson played an extreme part, writing the dissenting opinion. And we're specifically pleased to have special guests, the Honorable Denny Chin and Kathy Chin, who will be presenting a play on the fight for justice, the Fred Korematsu story, immediately after the presentation by Karen Korematsu. And then after the play reading, we are blessed to have the presentation by Professor John Q. Barrett, the Robert H. Jackson biographer, who will be putting the Korematsu decision into a form of context. On February 19, 1942, President Franklin D. Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066, uprooting some 120,000 Japanese Americans, two-thirds of them American citizens, from their homes on the West Coast and forcing them into concentration camps. Fred Korematsu refused to go. He was arrested and convicted of violating the executive order and related military proclamations. He appealed his conviction first to the Ninth Circuit and then to the Supreme Court. In 1944, the Supreme Court affirmed his conviction, upholding the executive order. Justice Jackson dissented. In 1983, nearly 40 years later, the federal court in San Francisco vacated Korematsu's conviction after evidence was uncovered showing that the government had supported evidence that undermined its assertion before the Supreme Court. I am honored beyond belief to present to you newly minted Dr. Karen Korematsu, the daughter of Fred Korematsu and the executive director of the Korematsu Institute. Karen Korematsu.
Good morning, everyone. It's so wonderful that you're here. I'm excited to be here. I just wish Jamestown was a little easier to get to. I'd come more often. But I want to thank Greg Peterson and Christine McMahon for inviting me here this morning to make a few comments. Unfortunately, this is Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month for the month of May, and I'm on a marathon travel schedule. So it's not that I don't love you, but I do have to leave around 10 or 10:15 or so because I'm being driven to Rochester to get to Washington, D.C., and then going on to Philadelphia after that. So it's been one of those journeys. But I'm very excited that, to honor my father's 100th birthday, that was on January 30th, as well as the 75th commemoration of Korematsu versus the United States, which is on December 18th of this year. And the point being, my father, for some of you who saw my father's documentary yesterday evening of civil wrongs and rights, the Fred Korematsu story, and it received 2 Emmys. And my brother, Ken, who is younger, was instrumental in getting that done. It took over 10 years to make. But you could tell that my father was a very humble and kind person. He never swore a bad word in his life. Neither did my mother, actually. So, especially maybe that generation. But he was never bitter or angry. That's what people don't are surprised about, because he was never bitter or angry. It was simply that he was right to violate the military orders or disobey the military orders, and the government was wrong to incarcerate 120 Japanese Americans without due process of law, right? So it wasn't complicated for my father. Sometimes in life we make things very complicated, and they don't really need to be. But I didn't know until my father's case was reopened in really 1982, 83, that he had never given up hope that someday he would be able to reopen up his Supreme Court case, but he just didn't know how to do that. You know, attorneys to our family, we didn't know any really, and they were expensive. And you just run up to someone and say, well, I want to reopen my Supreme Court case. You know, it doesn't work that way. And it took finding the evidence in Washington, D.C. It took finding the smoking gun that proved that there was no military necessity for the Japanese Americans to be incarcerated. You know, and as Greg said, that, you know, at the time, what they learned was that you know, Department of Justice had, you know, withheld evidence, destroyed evidence, and altered evidence that was to be presented to the Supreme Court. So who knows if they actually had all the facts, what would have been the decision? We don't know. But unfortunately, my father's Supreme Court case is now more relevant actually than it was in 1944, just because of all the civil rights, civil liberties violations that this country we're seeing and other people across this country are experiencing. The parallels between the Japanese American incarceration and the Muslim travel ban is obviously very clear, and my father would be very disgusted. He was still living in 2001 after 9/11, because he passed away in 2005. And we were standing in the kitchen, and I asked him, you know, Daddy, what do you think of all this? Because it was Attorney General Ashcroft that had cited my father's Supreme Court case as a possible reason to round up Arab and Muslim Americans and put them in American concentration camps again. That was 2001. And it's been kind of a continuation of, you know, different forms of really the violation of our civil rights and civil liberties. I mean, you know, in 1942 it was racial profiling. Now we're dealing with racial and religious profiling. You know, that's not what America's about. And my father would be very upset that we have not learned the lessons of history. That's what gets me up in the morning as I crisscross this country. Now my age range of audience is 5 years old to judges. So, because, you know, everyone needs to be reminded that, you know, of our responsibilities of social justice, of human rights, of upholding our civil liberties and the Constitution. My father, unfortunately, was not living when it was California Assembly Member Warren Furutani who wanted to have a Fred Korematsu Day of Civil Liberties and the Constitution for California. And so he worked hard with a lot of other colleagues to make that happen. He worked across the aisle. There was a support on both sides of the aisle, something that we don't quite see today, unfortunately. And in 2010, Governor Schwarzenegger signed the legislative bill creating and establishing Fred Korematsu Day of Civil Liberties in the Constitution for the state of California. Now it's a day of recognition. It's in perpetuity, and also the Education Superintendent of Instruction encourages teachers to teach about my father's fight for justice and how it relates to our issues today of immigration, national security, and racial profiling. But unfortunately, it's not a holiday. We're working on it. You know, you all want another holiday, right? So, and also this has been established in Hawaii, Commonwealth of Virginia, and even Florida, and New York City. So now the push is, you know, New York City and the state of New York. So here we are in the state of New York. So stay tuned. We may need your help. Because it really, at the end of the day, yes, it's wonderful to honor my father, but it's about our civil liberties and the Constitution. And our democracy is on attack. And, you know, it's important that especially as American citizens, that we participate and be civically engaged. So I encourage you to, you know, remember that, to make sure you vote, get other people to vote. Voting is our most precious gift that we have as American citizens, and we sometimes act like it's a throwaway. And that's not the way it should be. We want to teach young people, especially the 18 years old, they can register to vote. And it's important. It's an important voice that we have where we can make a difference. And so I encourage all of you to remember that and to support your community in making sure that the vote, people have access to voting, because it's so important if we're going to make change in this country. So you're going to hear this wonderful reenactment of my father's Supreme Court case, and I want to thank Judge Denny Chin and Kathy Chin, who are actually rock stars in my eyes. They're the superpower, and they've been doing these reenactments over the years, and I gave them the challenge, so they said, well, they couldn't say no, so that was good. But it was a challenge because the transcripts really weren't available. And now they even had to kind of do some edits, and unfortunately they have me in at the very end of this reenactment as part of current events. So I won't able to do that, but we have an outstanding stand-in for Mianna, who is going to be doing my part. So it's not very long anyway. But the point being is, so no pressure. But the point being is, as you know, last year the decision in Trump versus Hawaii came down from the Supreme Court on June 26th. And it was a majority opinion, but only 5-4, so it was very close. And the Justice Roberts, Chief Justice Roberts, gave the majority opinion, and certainly we were very disappointed that the court didn't see that this was really kind of a recreation of what the court did in '44. And if you ever read that opinion, please do, and also read Justice Sotomayor's dissent, because she wrote a scathing dissent that really brings in those parallels of 1944 and how this was really wrong. She usually ends her opinion by saying, "I respectfully dissent," but in this case, she just went to the jugular and said, "I dissent." And what I was very honored because I had, along with 2 other Supreme Court cases of the children of Jay Hirabayashi, the son of Gordon Hirabayashi, and Holly Yasui, the daughter of Min Yasui. We went together in our amicus brief, thanks to actually Aiken Gump, who did all the work pro bono, along with, we now have the Fred T. Korematsu Center for Law and Equality at Seattle University School of Law, and they do not only academia, but also the support of amicus briefs like that. And so, but my name was, Justice Sotomayor mentioned my name in her decision, and so I felt very honored that she recognized, because what we wanted to do was to remind the court of the danger of overreaching of power, that the branches need to be separate. We do, by the Constitution, we have, the executive and the judicial and the legislative, right? So it's, that this is when one branch it kind of encroaches on another, there's danger there. And the way that the Supreme Court, was created was so that wouldn't happen. And that to remind the court also of my father's 1944 Supreme Court decision, and also of Min Yasui and Gordon Hirabayashi's as well. However, of course, it was very disappointing. And what really was really disappointing, I need to say, is that when Chief Justice Roberts said in his decision that the case of Trump versus Hawaii, he said that Korematsu, meaning Korematsu versus the United States, has nothing to do with this case, right? He says Korematsu has nothing to do with Trump versus Hawaii. But then he goes on to say, but of course, Korematsu was unconstitutional, and he's going to kind of overrule it. I mean, it was just such a big throwaway. I mean, we don't even know actually what he overruled. I mean, that's still part of the discussion. And you know, Professor Barrett probably can chime in on that one. But what was so upsetting to me was that, you know, Justice Roberts and the majority had upheld the Muslim travel ban and marginalized another group of people like the Muslims and the Muslim community, and dishonored my father, all in one breath. And that was really what was so upsetting, and what drives me to even get up and do more in getting out in this country and trying to teach the lessons of history, because obviously we're not there. And the Korematsu Institute, the Fred T. Korematsu Institute that I established in 2009, we started off focusing on K through 12 education. If we have any teachers here, you can go to korematsuinstitute.org and sign up for our curriculum kits free of charge. That's what we do. We've impacted, I work with the New York Council for Social Studies. I've spoken at their conferences, the National Council for Social Studies, and we have elementary, middle school, and high school lesson plans, because we want, you know, this generation to learn the lessons of history as well, so we're not repeating them. But because of, you know, what's happening and all the requests for me to speak, because of my message and who my father was, that we are really promoting public civic engagement, that we want people to be involved in their own communities, and it starts, you know, it starts at home, right? In your own community, whether it's the Board of Education or the Board of Supervisors, to, you know, your state legislatures, to this nation. And, you know, once you start doing that sort of work, then it really helps yourself to be a better person, to really be what an American is all about. And, you know, we also believe that being an American is to support citizens and non-citizens, because we have that opportunity to make that difference. You know, no longer is terrorism just in this country, you know, as we heard, the terrorism in New Zealand. And so this is international. You know, we should be concerned about this world and about human rights. And that's why it's so important for all of us to be aware of, you know, what's happening now, and to be a part of the solution and not to be a part of the problem. So it's, you know, it's wonderful that you're all here. I have a lot to be grateful for the Robert Jackson Center, and especially I'm always quoting Justice Jackson. I'm going around and talking about the loaded weapon, and which is, you know, I mean, I would have never thought that I would be quoting Justice Jackson you know, in 2019, right? And I didn't actually. I haven't been doing this that long. My daddy gave me the charge to carry on with education 5 months before he passed away, because he was 85 years old then. He passed away at 86 the following year, and we had done an event down in LA, and he said he was just too tired. He couldn't do this anymore. Now it was up to me to carry on for education. And I thought, well, how am I going to do that? You know, because this was so far away from my own profession. I used to design hotels and restaurants and have my own design firm. I wasn't out there being a civil rights advocate or doing education. But with the encouragement of my father's legal team, who had encouraged my father and supported him, that we finally found the way to honor my father's legacy. And it's really now so more important than ever. I mean, he's the first Asian American in U.S. history to have a statewide day named after him. And he also represents those who have been marginalized, the Muslim community. And we need to teach, you know, this country that at the end of the day, we're all Americans. We have Martin Luther King Jr., who, you know, certainly in Rosa Parks in the African American community, Cesar Chavez, and where's the Asian American? And so that's where my father kind of fills that void. And it's important that we realize that You know, we've all come from somewhere. I mean, this country, as you know, was built on the backs of immigrants. You know, like your great-grandparents or great-great-grandparents. We all came from somewhere. Unless you're indigenous American Indian or indigenous Alaskan or Hawaiian, we didn't just sprout up from the ground automatically. We all came from somewhere, and it's important that we know our own story so we can appreciate other people's stories, and to realize that you know, immigration is not a dirty word. It seems like it's just been thrown as a reason to attack people, and you know, we can't stand for that. We need to stand up against that. That it's important that we have immigrants. And families are being torn apart. And in 1942, they were separating families, and now they're separating families at the border. You know, this is not what we're about, and we need to be accountable and responsible, and to have our elected officials also to do that as well. And it's unfortunate that, you know, we feel like maybe the executive is you know, in question, and even maybe the judicial. So we have to rely on the legislative branch to really, you know, make that difference and to push that urgency, because we need to be sure that we make change, and that the negative rhetoric that we're hearing across this country is not acceptable. And we want people to respect each other. What happened to respect? We want people to respect each other's differences. We're all different, and that's okay. We need to learn about those differences. And what I've said is that you know, prejudice is ignorance, and the only way to fight that is through education. It's our greatest weapon, as Nelson Mandela said. So we all need to be accountable for our own responsibility as American citizens. And you know, if my father were here, he would say to you, as he said in the film last night, stand up for what is right. When you see something wrong, don't be afraid to speak up. Thank you. So I wanted to leave time for questions, or Greg, you can ask questions. Audience, ask questions. Don't be shy. I get more. I mean, I don't see any hands. I mean, 5-year-olds are always like going up and, you know.
Karen?
Yes.
Though it was mentioned in the movie, one of the more interesting stories is how you, as a high school student, found out that your dad was, in fact, the Korematsu in the Korematsu case.
Yeah, that was an experience. You know, I grew up. My parents were met and married in Detroit, Michigan, and they went back to the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area. Actually, my father didn't think he'd ever want to go back to California, for obvious reasons. But because my grandmother Korematsu wasn't well, that they wanted to visit her, especially my grandfather was still living, and but they decided to stay. So both my brother Ken and I were born in Oakland, but went to schools in really small towns next to Oakland that were, you know, a lot of them were military families, and there was really still a lot of racism because it was, you know, still soon after the war. I was born in 1950, so now you know how old I am. But yeah, so I was a junior in high school, and a lot of times you study U.S. government and history. And my teacher had assigned all of us to read a different paperback book, but related to U.S. government and history. And I don't even remember what mine was, actually. But my friend Maya, who is Japanese American, third generation like I am, her book was called Concentration Camps USA. Interesting title. Then she goes on to describe the Japanese American internment. You know, that's what we called it back then. And I thought, well, that's interesting. I never had heard about that before. And she goes on to describe these terrible conditions, really inhumane conditions, and how 120,000 people were put in these American concentration camps across this country. And then she said, but there was this one man who resisted the military orders, and it ended up to be a landmark Supreme Court case called Korematsu versus the United States. Oh, that's my name. And I had 35 pairs of eyes turning around looking at me, and I'm shrugging my shoulders, thinking it's some black sheep of the family, because she never said Fred. And, because my father had an older brother. He was the third son of 4 boys, and the oldest son usually kind of gets, everything and doted on the most, but he didn't turn out to be such a shining light after all. And then my grandfather had a brother who worked in the flower nursery business with him before Pearl Harbor, but somehow disappeared. And so it was right after class. I said to Maya, "What's this about?" And she said, "Well, this is about your dad." I said, "No way! Somebody would have told me." So I go running home and confronting my mother, and she goes, "Yes, this is about your father." And I get the standard answer, "You'll have to wait till he gets home to ask him." So not only did he have housing discrimination, he had employment discrimination. And so it was 8 o'clock by the time he arrived at home, and I told him what happened. And he said, it happened a long time ago, and what he did he thought was right, and the government was wrong. That clear and simple. And it was like somebody just socked me in the stomach, and I could just see this hurt going over his face, and I couldn't ask him any more questions, except I asked him if he could vote, because voting was very important to my parents. They always studied the ballot. They discussed that in front of their children. They didn't discuss anything else. I didn't know that he wanted to reopen up his case. I didn't know anything about it. So and we didn't really talk about it again. So that was 1967 until 1982. Because it was just, and I didn't know what it meant to have a federal conviction. What does that mean? I didn't, it was way before Law and Order, so it's just, I knew it was too painful, and I not want to confront, especially my parents, being so close to them as I was, but I will always remember that like it was yesterday. I know exactly where we were standing in the house, and but he didn't say that he wanted to open up his case. I didn't ask him. It just none of that until the Professor Peter Irons, who visited my father to show him the evidence. Anyone else? That it?
Yeah, we're going to have to
wrap it up.
Take any more questions, but thank you very much, Karen. You've enlightened us as like nobody else.
Well, thank you.
And gave us information. Karen Korematsu.